for everyone coming. This would be an inaugural mini conference for the Belfast Anti War Group. Our first live in-person event, other than the little demonstrations and the stalls that we do in the city centre. And there's 3 talks today. The first one, I'll introduce you to Terina in a minute from Stop the War Coalition. First one's on the war in the Ukraine. The second one is on the experience of Julian Assange, the situation, the question of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, freedom of the press. And then the final talk is on, are we headed for a nuclear future? And there'll be someone to introduce each one as we go. There should be a little, if you want to put your name down to keep in touch with us, there should be a little piece of paper there that you can put your details down. We do regular stalls in the city centre every Saturday, usually from about 1 o'clock to 2. And we keep the arguments going around the question of the war in the Ukraine and how we will actually get peace out of that situation. The first speaker is going to be Terina Hine. Terina is somewhere in London, I'm guessing. Is that right? Yeah, that's good. Yeah. And Terina is going to speak for about 10 to 12 minutes on the war in the Ukraine, and Terina is the representative of the Stop the War Coalition, and they've got their own big action in London today. That's correct, isn't it? There's a rally in London. Right. Yeah, okay. So over to you, Terina.
Okay, well, firstly, thanks for inviting us here today. As my colleague there just said, I do have to leave at no later than past and possibly a little bit before to get to a rally that we're holding here in central London today. So I'll get straight to it. The role as anti-war activists is to mobilise to end the war in Ukraine. And as such, we have from the outset condemned the Russian invasion and called for peace talks. The Russian invasion began just over a year ago and is the latest phase in the bloody history of Ukraine, that borderland between East and West in Europe. Once again, this area of land has been marred by death and destruction, and it's undergoing one of the most severe humanitarian crises that Europe has seen since the Second World War. And at the moment, there is no end in sight. Neither the UK nor NATO have sought to seek an end to this war. Rather, they have seemed from the start bent on escalation. And what we have is the biggest military mobilization in Europe for decades. We seem to be sleepwalking into a hugely destructive great power confrontation. And clearly, this is no solution at all, either for Ukraine, for Europe, or indeed for the world. When the war in Ukraine began, the UK government made 2 points. Firstly, they claimed that the war had nothing to do with NATO expansion, and that was clearly not true. And secondly, they said that they would only arm Ukraine with defensive capabilities, that we would sanction Russia, but we would avoid any direct intervention. And clearly, what has happened is a very different story indeed. It is beyond doubt that NATO expansion provoked the Russian action. That doesn't excuse what Russia has done, but it helps explain why it occurred. And initially, NATO supplied defensive weaponry. There was anti-armor, anti-aircraft missiles, medical supplies, and Germany was sort of ridiculed for sending only defensive helmets. Well, how things have changed. Germany announced last year that it was going to double its military budget and it approved sending German-made tanks. Here, the MOD has successfully pushed our defence spending to increase dramatically. The US government has spent a whopping $50 billion in military assistance to Ukraine since the start of the war. This is an absolutely astonishing amount. Every day, military hardware is arriving at staging bases in Ukraine and Romania, taken by trucks across the border into Ukraine. Ukrainian soldiers are being trained in the use of US and Navy and NATO weaponry, and there is extensive intelligence sharing. And thanks to the leaked Pentagon documents, we know that there are NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine, and the UK supplying more special forces personnel than all our allies combined. And of course, you'll know that in the Republic of Ireland, In June, the Irish government is consulting on moving away from its long-held position on neutrality. Leo Varadkar has suggested that the country should become more involved in the common European Union defence policy. Sinn Féin too has refused to condemn NATO. At the beginning of April, we had Finland formally join NATO, and Sweden is awaiting its turn. And to what aim? None of this will help Ukraine. If we wanted to do that, we would be encouraging peace. The British government would be doing something about offering proper sanctuary to refugees. Anyone who believes that our callous government, who cares not one jot for its own citizens, is caring for those in some far-off land is simply kidding themselves. No, the primary aim of this action, the action of NATO, the action of UK, is for the US under its NATO umbrella to maintain its position of global hegemony. And this is why all the attempts that we have seen from China to broker peace or from Turkey have been ignored and dismissed. The UK, after its defeats in Afghanistan and Iraq, wants to reassert its global dominance. Early in the war, President Biden did what they call a misspeak when he said that Putin must not remain in power. Well, although the White House tried to row back at the time, it's fairly clear that he probably meant what he said. The goal is to weaken Russia, strengthen NATO, and the Ukrainians are paying for it with their blood. There was a New York Times article recently which reported Western militaries, especially those in the US, view Ukraine as a testing ground for new military technology. They see it as a laboratory for state-of-the-art weapons and information systems, and as to find new ways to use them. Western political officials and military commanders predict these new ways could shape warfare for generations to come. And these tests are viewed as vital preparation for any future confrontation with China. So the language is all about Russia losing and Ukraine winning. There is no room for diplomacy. Now, no one denies that negotiating with Putin would be easy, but there's not even an attempt to contemplate it. Instead, we have seen the successful creation of consensus to support the war, to support a never-ending push for arms, to defeat the evil Putin. We as citizens are told we have a binary choice. If you speak out against the war, you're pro-Putin. People are called traitors for calling for peace. The narrative is every reasonable person is on the same side. Russia is the evil enemy, NATO and the US, the white knights on horseback, riding to the rescue. The UK Parliament is united, the media is united, the PM and the leader of the opposition are united. Britain has been key in adopting a vanguard role within NATO, pushing for increasingly offensive military weapons. We pushed for the tanks, and then we pushed for the charge on fighter jets. And now we've even had our defense minister, agreeing to supply shells made with depleted uranium. All of this is clearly escalatory and very, very dangerous. We know, whatever they say, from Iraq, that depleted uranium weapons have very serious long-term health implications. They lead to the contamination of food, of groundwater for years to come. But that's okay, according to Jens Stoltenberg, head of NATO, because weapons, he says, are the way to peace. But we know that is simply not true. At each stage, there is the risk of escalation. At each stage in this war, we have seen taboos being broken. It wasn't, after all that long ago that NATO said tanks would draw us in to an open war with Russia. But NATO has been operating step by step, and with each step, it becomes more deeply immersed. And so it's hardly surprising when Russia, threatened as such, responds in kind. And we find ourselves closer than we have been for a generation to nuclear war, at least since the Cuban Missile Crisis, which, don't forget, was resolved only when the two powers involved got together and compromised. And of course, all of this militarization costs. We have given billions in military assistance. Last year, it was 2.3 billion, and Sunak and now Starmer has said this would be matched this year. Our financial commitment to this military buildup is second only to that of the Americans. Yet in stark contrast to this military spending, the government is completely dismissive when it comes to funding our public services, contemptuous when it comes to granting workers a pay settlement in line with inflation. And although the war is not the sole cause, it has severely impacted on the cost of living crisis being felt by all of us. Well, when I say all of us, perhaps not our super rich Prime Minister and his cronies in Parliament, but all of us here. And unfortunately, all our brothers and sisters in the global south who have been impacted severely by food and fuel prices. And of course, most seriously, those caught up in the fighting on both sides. So what now? The powers that be seem to believe Russia will back down, based on absolutely no evidence whatsoever. If Putin is backed into a corner, it could be incredibly dangerous. He may feel he has nothing to lose. And we're talking about a nuclear armed state here. And when there's nothing left to lose, what would prevent him from pressing that button? We hear all sorts of talks about tactical nuclear weapons. The whole conversation is making the use of nuclear weapons seem quite normal, quite usual, as though these things won't be devastating, both locally and for humanity as a whole. It is very, very frightening. For policy to be based on Putin accepting a military defeat is a massive gamble. And it's a gamble with the future of all our lives. It's a gamble by the very same strategists that were responsible for taking us so disastrously into the military quagmire of the last 20 years from Iraq to Afghanistan. How can we possibly trust their analysis? It is no wonder that the hands of the doomsday clock have moved closer than ever towards midnight. And if the war does continue in a conventional manner, well, the spring offensive is just beginning, and what is expected will be something similar to the trenches of World War I. The fighting in Bakhmut has been the most unthinkably horrific. A long war of attrition in which neither side makes progress, but thousands upon thousands die, more and more of Ukraine is turned into rubble. We're likely to see an Afghanistanization of Ukraine. And yet there is no opposition. In Labour, there is not even room for criticism or discussion of NATO. From the beginning, Starmer threatened that his MPs would lose the whip if they dared to criticise NATO, and in so doing, he effectively silenced the anti-war voice in the parliamentary party. And unfortunately, it has remained silent ever since. This lack of debate and dissent is clearly unhealthy in a democracy. So meetings like this one are absolutely crucial. As the reality of the war is becoming more apparent, as the dangers of escalation becoming clearer, the anti-war message is beginning to cut through. The general public are becoming aware of the nuclear threat and are very weary of long wars. We have a US election coming up soon, and the US public will not happily accept their government continuing to spend billions on yet another never-ending war. In January, there was a report by the US Rand Corporation, which is a think tank, called Avoiding a Long War, and it summed up the pros and cons of the war for Washington. It concluded that the advantages of a long war would be very minimal and significantly outweighed by its downsides. These include massive economic dislocation, huge direct costs to the West, the risk of nuclear war, and that the fact that Ukrainians will suffer most if the war drags on. So it recommends moves towards a resolution through negotiation. But in the meantime, the war rumbles on. And the beneficiaries, well, it's mainly the politicians who strut the world stage dressed in camo, wearing helmets intended for fighter pilots, and of course, the arms manufacturers, who have had an absolutely bonanza year. So as the anniversary of the war came, and we in the anti-war movement put on protests, what we discovered was around Europe, there were tens of thousands like us. Across the streets of Berlin, Paris, Italy, there were thousands and thousands of people going out to protest. Here, the movement has been smaller, and we need to confront the narrative head on. Our job is to make things clear, that things are not as black and white as we are told, that the talk of good versus evil gets us nowhere. We need to make sure people understand that this war is an imperial war between Russia and the US and NATO, with Ukraine a pawn. When 2 million of us marched against the war in Iraq, the media barons and politicians were against us then. And that included The Observer and The Guardian, although reading their coverage, you wouldn't have believed it. Their coverage recently on the anniversary, you wouldn't have believed it. But this time, when our case is actually more difficult to make because we aren't the invaders, it's harder for us to stand firm. It's harder for us to put our case across to the general public. And we have a lot against us, the whole propaganda machine against us. But that doesn't stop us standing up. It doesn't stop us mobilizing. It doesn't stop us taking this message into our communities and workplaces. Yes, it is difficult, and yes, we may be in a minority, but as more and more people become aware of the dangerous escalation, they are more willing to get involved and to listen to what we've said. I don't know how it's been for you guys in Belfast, but here in London and across the UK, our street stalls have been well received. You find people coming up to us and wanting to know more. People aren't disagreeing with us. They're intrigued. They're questioning. They don't know what's going on, and they're very happy to listen to us put our case across. Peace talks and negotiations are clearly the only way to end this protracted conflict. Delaying it will simply mean more loss of lives. We at Stop the War refuse to take lessons from those who have led us in decades of war. And we must point out how, although the government refuses to help the poor, it doesn't hesitate to pay for war. We must hammer home the risks and dangers of continuing escalation. And we must make it clear that our government is far from an innocent bystander in this war. And that, my friends, is the approach of Stop the War and what we hope to achieve by events such as this. Thank you.